All right, well, I will go ahead and get started since our time is limited today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar with Foley Hoag on ESG in 2022. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. I wanted to take a moment and thank all of you for taking time out of your day to tune into our webinar. We are so excited to have you here. I also want to thank our fantastic panelists who have spent time preparing for this webinar. We are so grateful for your participation and dedication. You can find their full biographies on the event page for this webinar located on eli.org. Today's event will be led by our fantastic moderator, Shailesh Sahai. He'll give a broad overview of ESG and give the panelists some time to introduce themselves and their work. After that, we'll have a roundtable discussion and there will be time for an audience Q&A at the end, but please don't wait until the end to submit your questions. You can submit your questions on Zoom's chat function as soon as you think of them. Please feel free to send them at any point during the webinar. Thank you again for your engagement. I will now introduce Shailesh and turn things over to him. Shay is one of the leading energy and environmental attorneys in the nation. He comes to Foley Hoag after serving for over 6 years as in-house counsel to the largest renewable fuels producer in the world and as acting general counsel of the largest renewable fuels trades association. Shay, I will turn things over to you. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Madison, and thanks for all your hard work in helping pull this together. So we have a really esteemed group of panelists today. I'm so excited they all took the time to come out and join us. But before I turn things over to them, I thought it'd be helpful to just provide just a couple of slides that lay out really how multifaceted ESG issues are. Share my screen here. Sorry, give me one sec. Yeah, hopefully that's working. Okay, great. So one framework to think about ESG issues is that it's been really well thought through by SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards. Obviously, the E, the S, and the G are for environmental, social, and governance. But SASB breaks things down into 5 categories. So they have environment, social capital, human capital, business model and innovation, and leadership and governance. So these topics, I think, in a lot of ways are a lot more broad than people think of when they first think of ESG. Obviously, some of the first things that come to mind are, climate change or maybe labor disclosures. And of course, those things are in here. Flipping back to environment, SASB, actually, I should pause. So what SASB does is they provide kind of a reporting framework for companies, well, among other things, but one of the things they provide is a reporting framework for companies looking to do ESG reporting. They provide guidelines on what should be included in ESG reports, and then again, provide these 5 categories. So within the environment category, SASB breaks things down into things that you would think of with ESG, GHG, air quality, et cetera. Within the social capital category, however, there might be some things that you wouldn't think of as falling within the ESG framework. Human rights, yes, but then things as broad as data security, product quality and safety, customer welfare, all these things fall within the ESG rubric established by SASB. Again, moving to human capital and these other categories, you see the same things: labor practices, product design and lifecycle management, business ethics, et cetera. So really broad swath, almost of all the activities a company engages in. Maybe everything except for shareholder value falls within the ESG to think about for companies. Interestingly, though, SASB, what they do to kind of help companies think through these issues is that they, for each industry sector, they highlight categories that might be the most material categories for that particular sector. For example, for the apparel sector, SASB thinks, social capital and business model and innovation might be the most material reporting categories. And then within those, you see some examples: management of chemicals in production, environmental and labor supply chain, et cetera, as what they think might be the most relevant to that particular industry. So that was just a quick sense of some of the things that companies wrestle with. Again, very broad and a lot to deal with as you're evaluating ESG issues, either inside or outside the company. But I'm going to let my colleagues dive into this in a lot more detail, and then we'll get into it more in a Q&A format, as I've already discussed. So with me here today are Elizabeth Lewis, who's the managing director and deputy head of ESG at Blackstone, also my friend for about 25 years. Roger Martella, who's an ELI veteran, of course, and vice president and sustainability officer at GE currently. Steve Rothstein, who's managing director of the Ceres Accelerator for Capital Markets. Ceres obviously has been involved in this area for decades, so really great that Steve could join us as well. So what we'll do is I'll flip it over to my colleagues to walk us through, just maybe 5 or 10 minutes of primer material each on ESG issues, and then we can dive into the Q&A format. So Elizabeth, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. My role at Blackstone is as deputy head of ESG is to serve in a firm-wide role to really advance what we see as our most important ESG topics across the firm. We feel that we have a really strong opportunity to integrate ESG very clearly into our businesses because of the model that we have in our private equity portfolio, especially where we're often majority owners of companies. We partner very closely with them to create value in a number of different ways, and ESG is increasingly an important component of that. And then we have a very large real estate portfolio, and we're the largest owner of commercial real estate in the world. And so those two are just two examples of ways that we think ESG can really be powerful for our business model. And I can talk a little bit about how we do that. I will say that while ESG is sort of a new term for many people, there has been a lot of work over decades in this industry before it was specifically called ESG. And of course, climate and environmental issues form the basis of many of these things that Shay was describing in terms of the SASB framework. Now we just have, I think, better tools for understanding how environmental and social risks actually impact the valuation of companies, and better tools for companies to determine what is most material to them as they are thinking about ESG. It's really exciting that the topic is becoming more mainstream, and because I think there's a lot more professionalism that's brought to that. It's been brought to the industry now. So I'm going to show you just one slide that gives a good overview of how we think about environmental social governance issues across our portfolio. Of course, we think about it very strongly at the Blackstone firm level, but we also know that where our real impact can be is with our portfolio companies, that real estate portfolio that I described, and then over 250 other portfolio companies. So I'm going to show you this slide as just a level setting. And it's important to know that to do this well across a firm size of Blackstone, we now have over 20 people focused on ESG. So it's not just me. And I think that's just a really sort of important level setting for you about how much work goes into this. Okay, so can you see that? It's probably not the right. Can you see the slide on ESG? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So on the environmental front, we have a commitment to reduce emissions across our portfolio in any company, across companies where we control energy usage over the first 3 years of ownership by 15%. And so when you think about what we need as society to get to net zero by 2050, It's 4.5% a year of emissions reductions. And so we are proud of this target because it's informed by climate science. And we have a team of people who are expert in going into companies, actually helping them do this work and make sure that it's documented. We've committed over $15 billion since 2015 into investments that are, we believe, are consistent with the energy transition. And we've now projected out that we see opportunity for investing another $100 billion in energy transition and climate change solutions. And I should say that, well, of course, the investment teams are driving much of this. It's been very interesting to see just how much they're now relying on us ESG professionals to help understand the market and identify opportunities and due diligence them, and then to work with them after investment. We are undertaking a very large carbon footprinting exercise for all of our investments. We believe this is now table stakes for companies to understand what their carbon footprint is, and to be able to, especially for those for which carbon is the most material issue, they need to understand this and be able to work on it. In terms of social, we have a target of at least 1/3 diverse representation on boards that we control. We know that diverse boards lead to better decisions, and there's all sorts of data outside Blackstone to support this as well. We have a career pathways program, which is a program that's designed to get untapped talent, people from historically underrepresented backgrounds, into our portfolio companies and give them the tools to be able to advance in their careers at portfolio companies. This is very exciting. This draws on a lot of lessons that we learned from bringing veterans into our portfolio companies. We've hired over 100,000 veterans since 2013. So just extremely proud of that accomplishment. And then we spend a lot of time with our companies teaching them best practice governance, right? So we want them to report to their boards regularly on ESG, as we do at Blackstone. We want them to collect data and send to us on a quarterly basis, and then we do a bigger effort annually. Data is becoming an increasingly important part of the picture and to ESG. And then we consider ESG factors in the investment process. And we use this really not just to identify risks, but to drive value increasingly. And we can talk a little bit more about that's going. But thank you very much. I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it back over to Shay and the other panelists.
Sounds great. Thanks, Elizabeth, for the initial thoughts. Excited to dig in more on all that stuff. Roger, you want to take it next?
Sure, Shay, thank you very much. And thank you to Madison, ELI, Shay, you. I'm excited to be here with Elizabeth and Steve. I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's an honor. And what I want to do is take a couple minutes just to focus on 3 different letters, just to make things more complicated. CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, and how that fits into ESG. Given this is ELI, I imagine we have a lot of folks on the phone who are really paying attention to how this intersects with the law, how this intersects with trends in the law. I thought maybe I'd take my GE hat off for a minute, share some of those observations. I'm sure, Shay, we can come back and get into some of the GE more focused initiatives and things like that. But I wanted to do that because I feel like we're at such a pivotal transformational moment right now in environmentalism, environmental law, environmental issues. And we're after a half century of kind of progress since the 1970s. There's a big change going on, kind of the who, the what, the how, and the who's leading environmental progress. And I see this as the rise of corporate social responsibility. I think this is a very positive thing. It's going to help us solve these issues. And I hope to leave with a sense of optimism. I also know it's a bit provocative that we're seeing a transformational shift where corporate social responsibility is going to lead environmental progress. But it's not just my opinion. Here's a slide here from the Edelman. This is the Edelman Trust Index, and they surveyed 36,000 people in 28 countries. This is a 2022 survey that came out just a few weeks ago and asked, who do you see as the most trusted institution? And businesses came out on top in 2022. I think a lot of that is post-COVID, seeing a lot of responsive businesses, which has some analogies to CSR and even ESG. Now, to be fair, businesses didn't rank so high on environmental issues. This is just the overall chart. But it was really telling to me that I think we are in the midst of this transformation where there's this growing trust in corporate social responsibility to take the initiative to solve some of these very complex global issues, climate change, the energy transition, access to healthcare, and so on, that we're confronting right now. We saw that with COVID. We're seeing it again with Russia and Ukraine, how much focus there is on company positions and the pressure that's bringing to hopefully put pressure on that conflict. So if we turn to the next slide, I want to be clear, I'm not here as a shill for corporations. I'm not here to say that companies are going to solve these issues. My theme is that corporate social responsibility is the transformation we're seeing. And that's more than companies. We have Steve on the phone from Ceres. Ceres is a key stakeholder to many large companies working in this space to keep, I'd say, keep companies in check, work in good partnership as a stakeholder to make sure that companies are making progress at improving their impacts, at doing public good. And so this theme of corporate social responsibility is more than just companies. It's the notion that we're bringing in a broad swath of stakeholders, starting with employees, investors, customers, communities, NGOs, and governments to help address these issues. I think that's the key to understanding why we should feel optimism about some change. And if we go to the next slide, again, I know the audience here a little bit, they're very familiar with kind of at ELI, the first 50 years of environmental law. And what we saw in the beginning of environmental law was huge amount of progress. We had bipartisanship coming and enacting statutes, laws that made a lot of progress at addressing the pressing environmental problems of the time. They continue to do that today. But starting like in the late 20s, the late aughts, greenhouse gases, climate change, the global challenges became more of an issue. And we continued to use the same tools we had used before, but we haven't seen the same progress. We haven't seen the same success, I think, since this time that we saw in the early days. So using the same tools in the toolbox hasn't resulted in the same success. So the question that gets presented then is, well, what if we switch up the tools in the toolbox? And what if we try different tools to address these global issues going forward? So if we go to the next slide, that's really my thesis, that corporate social responsibility, can we go back one, I think, please? Yeah, there we go. So as we enter what I call the global sustainability area, we have corporate social responsibility, which is kind of enforced through ESG, kind of monitored through ESG, to some extent policed through ESG, and some of the things that Elizabeth was talking about as really the driver for this transformational change. We have this broad swath of stakeholders, much broader than before, as the catalyst. We have companies acting by developing the technology and innovation and the financing, the sustainable finance the world's going to need to address these issues. We have a goal that's, I think, even beyond climate or energy transition, it's really equity, making sure that everybody has the same opportunity to prosper, that we're addressing impacted populations, vulnerable populations. This is recognized through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, 3 more letters need to learn in this space. Going from a regulatory system, we have accountability that's happening in real time. It's not like the government finds something out, your years in litigation, maybe there's a penalty at the end of the day. We have our stakeholders in real time calling us up on the phone, sending us emails saying, we want to challenge you on this. We have a question about that. We want you to be accountable and so on. So there's huge accountability to a broad swath of stakeholders. The politics become less of a hindrance. If we're hitting some gridlock with politics, it'd be good if government can support this. It'd be good if government can help incentivize this through the infrastructure bill. But this progress is going to happen regardless. It's not going to be gridlock for progress. And there's these notions, as Elizabeth talked about, what are near-term goals, midterm goals, long-term goals? How can people have a sense of how this is playing out? And so with these tools in the toolbox, I think it gives us some optimism that this transformation is going to be more successful direction at solving these issues. And so if we go to the last slide here, just to conclude and wrap things up, again, after 50 years, I do think we're in the midst of this transformation. We have a broad range of catalysts, including Ceres and many other types of stakeholders who are part of this solution. Government still has an important role. They always will, and it's a very complementary role. It's a partnership role. They can help partner with success. I posted something on LinkedIn last week talking about this, and within 24 hours, someone from DOE kind of thanked me for it, and publicly said, we look forward to the partnership to achieve these mutual goals. That's exactly, I think, what we want to see in these types of relationships. We've got a legal audience, I think, primarily on the phone. I'm happy to come back and chat about what is the role of lawyers in all this. But we also have this shared goal that I think if I were to sum it up, it's really equity. Every life is important, every person matters. And multinational companies working with their stakeholders are in a unique position to make sure we're addressing those vulnerable populations. We're lifting up the quality of life through access to healthcare, access to electricity, access to economic opportunities, while protecting from climate change, while protecting from environmental issues. So Shay, again, I'm happy to come back, talk about what we're doing at GE to achieve this, but I thought I would maybe orient it because I do think we're at this pivotal transformational moment where we're seeing the new tools in the toolbox move progress in this direction.
Great, thanks so much, Roger. That is a really interesting and overview of how things have evolved. Look forward to digging in. Steve, you want to?
Yeah, actually, what I'd love to do, instead of talking about what I was going to talk, just talk to Roger and Elizabeth and you about all the things you've already presented, because there's so much great information. But I'll kind of jump in. Again, Stephen Rothstein. I'm the managing director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. If you're not aware, Ceres has been around for over 30 years, working with investors, companies, policymakers, and regulators. It started over 30 years ago after the Exxon oil Valdez spill, with investors saying they need to learn more about the policies of companies, not because it's, quote, good for the environment, but because from a fiduciary perspective, it's important. So where are we today? I'll give you a little bit of how I think the environment has changed. But the biggest thing, and it really builds on what Elizabeth and Roger and you were saying, is that climate is, specifically in ESG issues, are no longer just a CSR philanthropy issue, but it's part of the core financial responsibility. Last year, oil companies wrote off $145 billion, $145 billion, and that's in their equity investors, their debt, their insurance are going to take some combination of that. Our country as a whole, we spent 150 billion and 688 lives were lost because of that. We've all seen disruptions because of supply chain, because of the pandemic and other things, that while the East Coast last summer was facing Hurricane Ida, the West Coast was in the biggest drought, and now it's been recorded in 1,200 years. So these issues are no longer environmental issues. These are also business issues. So I spend my day talking with regulators and business leaders and bankers, and their job is to think about what is in the fiduciary responsibility for those respective entities. And what we believe fundamentally, and there's lots of data, just the recent IPCC report just recently, 2 weeks ago, came out that highlighted this again, is that it is in your responsibility to look at this. And conversely, if you're a director of a company or a CEO or a chief legal officer, and you're not thinking about these issues, that you're increasing your risk. So it is, we don't think you should do it because it's good for the environment. Yes, it is, but it's also good for business. Ceres works with investors, with companies. So with investors, how has that changed? In the last 2 years, 2 years ago, we asked a lot of investors whether they would want to set a net zero plan to go from where they are today to by 2040 or 2050 be at net zero with interim goals, make them science-based. 2.5 years ago, almost no investor, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, said they want to do that. As of now, with great international partners through the investor agenda and other things, there's $57 trillion of assets. That's over half of the publicly managed assets around the world that have made those commitments. Now, those are just the first steps they're taking, but those are big steps. There's every day, Fortune 500 companies make decisions that think about climate or other ESG issues. Today, 92% of the Fortune 500 companies, 92% report on their climate disclosure. Now, it's not enough, it's on a voluntary basis, but there is a lot of information out there. So businesses see it is in their business interest, similar to what was just said, to look at some of these issues. Climate more so than some of the other ESG issues. Some of those are further behind. One of the biggest things that's happening is a week from today is the Securities and Exchange Commission will announce their proposed rules for climate disclosure. So if you're interested in this, on the 21st at 11 a.m., if you go to the SEC website, you'll see what their proposal is. They will give 30 or 60 days for comment. We've submitted extensive comments already. Many of you probably have. in their what they call the notice of inquiry. If you want information on that, happy to talk to you offline. But that's the foundation. We can't solve any problem. There isn't any business problem that any of you work on that you can't first measure the problem. Measuring is the first step to managing it. And right now we have lots of different protocols for disclosure. So we think this is a really important initiative. There are lots of other things going on from electric utilities and electric vehicles and food and forestry to mention as well. Two other just quick things I'll say. For those of you interested in the broader area of ESG, we have a partnership with Berkeley, and we have a course, an online course on ESG. So again, if you can either go to the website or we can share more information about that as well. So there's a lot more there, but I'll turn it back to you and eager to get into the questions.
Awesome. That's great, Steve. And I do think it's a really fascinating time. I think those of us who've been thinking about these issues, for a long time, I studied, atmospheric chemistry in undergrad, we realized there's going to have to be a businesses based on climate. But when businesses had to realign their business models with the science of climate change, exciting that we're finally here, right? This is the kind of time period we've been waiting for our whole careers, where businesses are doing exactly that. So very cool observation. We actually already have a couple of, or at least one question from the audience. So I'm actually just going to kick us off with that. And other folks who are on the call, please to chime in with additional questions. But here we have a question. When we think about adoption and implementation of ESG commitments, are there different trends among publicly traded firms versus privately held firms? So I bet each of you has probably an interesting take on this. Maybe Steve, you want to kick what Roger and Elizabeth have to say about it as well?
Sure, I'm happy to kick it off. And again, I appreciate Elizabeth being on this, representing obviously a major firm on the private equity side, and the work that they're doing is great. Overall, I am grossly oversimplifying, but the public firms, larger firms, public firms, you can see more progress. Now, is that because that they're reporting it more? It could be some of that. It also could be because they're larger, so they can afford to look at some of these systems and collect some of this data. But so far, you've seen more progress on some of the larger public firms and also on the public equity side than the private equity. Again, not Elizabeth and her team are working hard at this, and we have a group of private equity firms that we meet with all the time. Just as part of that. So we're progress on both, but more on the public side.
Well, I can go. And so, I mean, I should also mention Blackstone is a public company. So I have a bit of a perspective from both sides. And I can assure you that our shareholders care a great deal about climate issues, as do our limited partners in our funds. And I think, I think it's very hard to generalize, right? Because even in the private equity space, there are companies that are, that includes venture capital companies, right? And very small startup companies all the way to very large privately held companies. I'm a strong believer, and I've experienced this throughout my career in the private equity industry, that there's a lot of opportunity for the really hands-on work the energy transition is going to require in the private equity investment model. And this is because the companies that we invest in, many of the companies that we invest in are growing quickly. They see a lot of opportunity ahead of them. Many of them would like to position themselves to go public, and they're taking our capital at Blackstone in part because we can help them get there, right? And so now ESG has just become another way that we are appealing to companies that we want to invest in, and then another thing that we're offering them in terms of value add as we prepare them to grow and get their next set of capital, whether that's in the private markets or the public markets. And so again, there's this capital opportunity here that I believe very strongly is in the public markets, the private markets, and by the way, also the credit markets. I think that's another whole other asset class that is just the capital that is available is much more available if you're sustainable than if you're not. I also think that what we see with the private equity model too is that you can make capital investments, right? The thing about energy transition is that it's not linear. You have to make often a lot of big capital investments that then pay out over many years, and that can often be very well suited to investors that have this long-term time horizon versus a quarter by quarter by quarter, right? You have to hit earnings every quarter. So that's certainly what we've seen in many of our investments, and including, by the way, in sort of midstream companies, which have capabilities such that are going to help us all move from gas to, say, green hydrogen. They're going to help us actually commercialize CCS type technologies, right? And so we can partner with them to do those types of things. But I would say it's you have to choose the right model for your asset class. But I see a lot of exciting, I guess, growth and opportunity on all asset classes, including other things like credit.
And Shay, I would just add briefly, I can't speak to private companies, and so I want to draw a comparison between public and private. I think Elizabeth's right. I think we're probably seeing a lot of companies do really well, public and private, and there's probably both that can improve too. But in terms of the questions of the trend, I would just echo something Steve said. I think the biggest trend we're seeing with public companies is that the rigor of ESG reporting is quickly rising to the rigor of financial reporting. And we're headed towards a trajectory where those two things are just going to merge. Maybe it's not the same document or something, but it's going to be the same rigor, the same standards, the same controls that are put into place both in the EU and the US. I don't know that private companies are necessarily feeling that type of pressure or seeing that trend directly, but for public companies, it's an inevitability that we're preparing for.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, private companies, even if you have some European investor, right, through your fund, or you're subject to that. So that I can't, agree more that the European regulations are driving a lot of this action globally around the world.
All right, interesting stuff. So different drivers on the public and private side, but there's pressure coming from both ends to focus on the. So Roger, let me take you up on your offer. Do you want to tell us more about what's going on, with CSR, ESG, sustainability at GE?
So I think, when we think of GE, so for those of you who may not be completely up to speed on what GE looks like today and where it's going tomorrow, we're functionally focused on three overarching sustainability goals. The ESG side of what we do is how we improve our impacts. Our priorities there are safety, environmental stewardship, which includes climate change and other things, the E and ESG, addressing human rights and ethical supply chain, and philanthropy. So our ESG approach is those are our priorities, and there's many other things in our 100-page report, but we focus on safety, environment, human rights, and philanthropy. But effectively, we're also, going back to corporate social responsibility, we also focus on how we can be part of the solution in solving three of the world's most pressing sustainability challenges. First is the energy transition and climate change. GE provides equipment that produces 1/3 of the world's energy. It includes renewable energy, gas power, grid, and nuclear. But at the same time, we're investing in breakthrough technologies to make sure we can help our customers achieve net zero goals through carbon capture sequestration, hydrogen, small modular reactors, renewable energy turbines that don't include rare earth minerals. So you want to do these two things simultaneously. You want to provide the state-of-the-art technology today, and you want to be investing today in the breakthrough technologies you need for tomorrow, so we can reach this path of net zero by 2050, which GE has also announced. So that's number one, climate change and energy transition. Number two is the future of flight. Demand for flight, demand for transportation is growing. This is important. People need, getting back to the notion of equity, opportunities to stay connected to friends, to their networks, economic opportunities so they can prosper. And we want flight to be more sustainable. So 2 out of every 3 planes use GE engines, I think 3 out of every 4 takeoffs. And so we're invested again in how we can innovate technology today so that we can help our customers, help countries reach their net zero ambitions for the future. You're up against the laws of physics here, it's complicated, but you need to make those investments today for technology 10, 12, 13 years down the road so we can keep this trajectory. And the third, which is hugely important, is healthcare. Making half the world's population is underserved by healthcare. This is a core sustainability goal, again, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and making sure that we're providing access to healthcare to those people who are hard to reach. So everyone has the chance to have a healthy lifestyle, be healthy. We have ultrasound technology now about the size of an iPhone. You can put it in your pocket, do ultrasounds, bring the healthcare to the people, use artificial intelligence. So healthcare, aviation, and energy transition, climate change, those are our three primary focuses. We're splitting into three businesses, evolving into three businesses. Sustainability will be a core to all those three businesses, both in addressing our ESG and impacts and being part of the solution and innovating this technology.
Awesome, super interesting. I have a feeling you were prepared for that question. Elizabeth, turning back to you, could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the evolution of ESG at Blackstone? It seems like you guys have really ramped up ESG efforts in the last couple of years. Like how are your ESG professionals staffed, and kind of what various roles do they play?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So yes, while I think for many years we've our investment process has integrated certain things that you would now call ESG, it's really become a much more front and center part of our business, and integrated fully into our investment process over the last few years. It started really out of our legal and compliance department, and has grown not within that department, but also much more broadly, to include now dedicated ESG professionals. So people like myself who have different expertise than was prevalent at the firm until recently have been hired in. We have over 20 people full-time focused on ESG across both our corporate team and then in our business units now. And so these people are really in the business units. They're very operationally focused, working hand in hand with our investment teams as they due diligence investment opportunities and then post-investment. So again, getting to what I was talking about before, where we really do roll up our sleeves and partner with our companies to help make them better and stronger and more resilient. And ESG is a critical part of that now. I would say, on the legal and compliance side, just to mention, we are now pretty much work across L&C in a number of different ways, in a number of different capacities. We have an amazing sort of fully integrated L&C team that our ESG team works with across L&C. And I should put a note out that we are actively in the market for ESG dedicated legal and compliance resources. So any recommendations, please do send them my way. In terms of why we're structured the way we are, there are a lot of drivers here. Our investors, as I mentioned, both shareholders and LPs, are really focused on ESG. There are the regulatory pressures, Europe, the SEC rulemaking that was referenced, and then other parts of the world. Our own employees are expecting this, and our portfolio company employees are expecting this. And now I think a really interesting trend for us is that potential portfolio companies are actually screening potential investors on their ESG credentials, right? So companies can take capital from many different sources. Increasingly, they are interviewing us, right, about how much we can offer them in terms of helping them build out their ESG program. So I think that's a really interesting development. And we have a pretty key role in investment decisions. So just to put it out there, I think this varies across firms, but we have pretty much accountability up to the very top. And in our view, especially when it's an investment that touches on an important ESG issue, the ESG person is often called on in the meeting where we're discussing the investment, and has a critical role in the decision making table. And then I would just say the last thing, we are thematic investors. We've invested across a number of themes pretty successfully over the years at Blackstone, and it's been exciting to see ESG and especially energy transition emerge as one of these investment themes that we're now putting capital around at large scale across all asset classes, especially infrastructure, real estate, private equity, and credit. So hopefully that's helpful. Happy to answer any other questions further.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I mean, the kind of way it's become a cross-cutting feature of the business, I think is really fascinating. And on the screening issue, actually, even on the law firm side, we've started to see potential clients screen us on ESG, which is obviously a relatively new thing. So we're starting to get surveys and questions about what our policies are and what our commitments are. So it's well, Steve. So you referenced this, and then so did Elizabeth just now. But obviously, we've got this super exciting, if you can call it that, SEC proposal coming up. Proposal coming up shortly. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, kind of what we can expect, what the scope is, what some of the elements might be?
Sure. Well, let me tell you what we're advocating for. I would not presume to tell you what the SEC is going to do, but what we're advocating for, and we meet with them on a regular basis, but we'll see how far they go. For many of the folks in this call, you were probably involved. Last summer, the SEC had a notice of inquiry, a set of questions, and we and lots of other people filed comments. But some of the key points are, we believe it should have a basis of TCFD, such that is emerging as a worldwide basis, so that we're not doing new systems. There's enough good out there that we hope that it covers scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 3 is, as some of the questions have alluded to already in the chat. Scope 3 is more complicated, so there might be a phase-in for scope 3, or maybe they start with the larger companies. But we've advocated for scope 3 across the board, that it looks at GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, and use the other systems for that it be in the financial report, that again, while over 90% of the companies they have some kind of environmental reports, very few are in their 10K. We believe it has to be in the 10K, has to go through the level of checks and balance that a 10K would look at. That again, in answer to another question that's in the chat, we don't think that the SEC is going to mandate net zero plans for companies. Our senses view that outside of their mission, unlike what the UK and some others are looking at already. But that if a company, what we've advocated for, if a company has set a net zero plan, that they're required to say how they're going to get there, what their interim steps to get there is. There's a whole question of whether it will meet assurance requirements, auditing and other things, and I'm happy to talk more about that if people want. And then there's a dozen other issues, from what's covered in private equity to water and biodiversity, that again, we hope there's some comment there. There is a separate rulemaking on human capital issues that's very, very important, but probably won't be in this rule that the SEC has guided. There'll be a separate rule. And there's another one working on fund naming. So right now, there could be the XYZ ESG fund or green fund, but it may or may not be a green fund. So in answer to another question in the chat, that there is some greenwashing going on now, that there are companies who list a green fund but don't have the rigor. And so, but that's a separate process that the SEC will look at. So those are some of the key things. But again, I can't emphasize enough that I encourage everybody, either individually or through your company or your clients, to think about submitting comments. That wherever you are on this, that comment file will be very important. And I'll put my email in the chat. And if people have questions, happy to talk individually offline. So those are some of the key issues. I will, before I turn it back, just allude to something else that was said earlier. We're talking about climate risks, and there are enormous risks, but there are also enormous opportunities, as was said. Secretary Kerry has said on more than one occasion that if the world's spending now around $150 billion to meet climate energy needs in emerging nations, and there's an issue that obviously relates to Blackstone, to GE, and so many others, 150, that number has to grow to close to $1 trillion. And that's just an example of the opportunity. So there's a big risk side, but there's also a way to make money on this climate transition as well. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
That's great. Really good insights, and obviously very timely as we're awaiting the SEC announcement. So I'll throw one out there for anyone. We have a question about greenwashing, kind of how serious is it? But I'm curious as to, how you all deal with exaggerated environmental claims, within your organizations or from an outside perspective. Obviously, FTC has the green guides, that's what the SEC is getting at as well. Yeah. Let me call on someone so this is less awkward. Roger, I'm calling on you first.
I appreciate the question. It is a very serious issue. I'd say it's a top tier issue, top 3 issue, the question of greenwashing. And companies do need to take very significant procedures and protocols in place to, 1, to avoid it, and 2, to addressing even well-intentioned communications that cross the line. So our approach is very much a conservative one. We want to be beyond reproach. If someone even raises an argument that perhaps we overstated something, I've failed. I don't even want to have a debate with someone about it. So we take a very conservative approach. Doesn't mean we have to be boring, but we do want to be very specific in terms of what we are articulating in the space to not be misleading, to not be overstating things. So we have a number of procedures in terms. We have like a 5-element checklist that we go through for anything we communicate in this space. Anything we say in the sustainability space has to be kind of checked, audited, verified objectively before we say it. Make sure if someone were to ask, is there backup there? That again is beyond reproach. If we have to debate it, it's too close to the line. We want to avoid semantic words, as Steve was talking about, green, clean. A lot of really well-intentioned people, come up with some great product and it's going to do great things, and they get really excited to want to say this is green, this is clean. And unfortunately, I have to bring them bad news and talk about why we're not going to do that. We look internally, about making sure everything we say externally is consistent with internally. So we do put a lot of effort into this. And I think it's important. It's important for the folks who are looking at these communications, understanding them. It's also important from a competitive perspective. We see a lot of businesses who aren't as careful, whether it's intentional or not. And it is not only frustrating for the people who are receiving this message, it can be frustrating for me too. I think see some folks play fast and loose with this. So very important issue. I appreciate the person raising it, but they're right to be focused on it. And everyone should be invested for a variety of reasons and making sure they're putting a lot of resources into addressing it.
Elizabeth, I saw your head nodding a lot during Roger's talk. You have anything to add to that?
I mean, not much. It resonated a lot with me in my experience inside Blackstone. I think, we always want to be conservative and cautious. And we have developed, just very careful procedures around how we sort of account for everything that we're going to say. And it's actually, helpful as we're starting to think also about, future commitments we might make or future targets that we might set. We want to be very careful to know that we can implement those and hit those. And I think that's just a good understanding to have internally. In a big organization, it requires a lot of people and people with different expertise and perspectives. But we think that when we do make targets then and commitments, they're going to be strong, and we know we're going to be able to hit them. We're not going to put out things just for the sake of having a nice soundbite. So sometimes that leads us to be a little bit more conservative, but that's where we'd rather be.
And it just, as I agree with everything our colleagues have said, while climate, we've talked a lot about that. On the other elements of ESG, there's even less definition. So what should be the standard for diversity or biodiversity or dealing with indigenous rights, or the list goes on and on and on. And the companies are getting in challenging. I mean, just this weekend, you saw Disney have an issue with the Don't Say Gay legislation in Florida and their position on that. So I think the questions of definition are important across ESG, in addition to those specifically on climate issues.
Okay, well, that leads me to another good question from the audience, and maybe this one is well, it's very timely. So the question is, have kind of and Ukraine on ESG. obviously on the one hand, very relevant to, particularly the S&G portions of things. On the other hand, there have been some statements by some, leaders in finance that, maybe it's not the role of companies to be, making decisions about foreign policy. And so I'd be curious as to what your thoughts are on, the intersection of those issues.
I'm happy to jump in first, in that I think it is absolutely critical. First is we can't talk about this without recognizing the heartbreak and the awful, inhumane actions that we're all witnessing every day, and it is tragic at a level. But then when you take a step above that, there are now hundreds of companies that have decided to leave Russia, and some have left in different ways. Some have left for political issues, some for reputational issues, some for moral issues, some because their employees have raised these issues. But those are ESG issues in a sense. I mean, a lot of the companies that have made the decisions may not be in their, or are not in their short-term financial interest, but it's still in the company's interest as they think about them in society. So I think that is an example where companies, we've never seen in the history, at least that I'm aware of, so many countries make such big decisions that affect literally billions of dollars of assets. And now there's a article that Putin says he might nationalize assets that have been left. Whether he does that or not, who knows? So I do think it's relevant among this heartbreak that we see every night on TV.
And I would just echo what Steve said briefly and share, the remorse there. I do have a loved one and family who's from the disputed part in eastern Ukraine, and seeing them wake up every morning and read the news is put things even in closer perspective than I probably otherwise appreciate. But it does, I think, reinforce the notion of, again, the rise of corporate social responsibility. There's no doubt about it. I think we saw it with COVID, but if you're seeing many articles and summaries every day of what are companies doing to support Ukraine, to put the pressure on Russia. And it's again, how quickly people are looking, going back to the Edelman Trust Index, how quickly people are watching what companies are doing, the steps they are taking to reinforce both the pressure and the messages here, which I think is, again, at an unprecedented level. And I think it's a positive thing. I think we've seen companies step up and send very strong messages there to the extent they can, while keeping people safe and so on, and balancing all those things. So it's just, I think, a more reinforcement of the trend I identified earlier, the transformation we're going through.
Cool. Well, thank you for your input. That's obviously like a very, a sensitive topic, but I think helpful to hear your take on those issues. Staying with this theme of Europe, Elizabeth, you had mentioned that European standards are kind of impacting Blackstone's thinking on ESG issues, kind of almost as much as American standards. Can you dive into that in a little bit more detail? A lot of us, including me, are kind of less familiar with the European regulatory frameworks than the American ones, I think.
Sure. Yes. And I will, again, everybody understands that I'm not a lawyer. So I actually spend quite a bit of time with my legal experts, who are just such a great partner on this, in particular, the SFDR regulation, which is the one I was specifically referring to, sustainable finance disclosure regulation. And so this is, I think, one of the objectives of this rule is very much to help guard against greenwashing, to our discussion before, right? So as an investor, you select an article that your fund should go in, depending on whether you want it to be how green you think that your investments are going to be, and the actual intent of your investments being green. So it's something where if you have European investors or European companies that you're going to work with, it's becoming very impactful. And for many organizations, we have funds that are commingled vehicles, right, that have European investors along with others. So even if many of your investors are from other parts of the world, you still must take this into account as you're designing your fund. And then there's the separate part, which is the EU taxonomy, where they've categorized which investments are which. And I think we had a prior discussion about definitions not being totally clear. So that's one guide for us right now, is the EU taxonomy, which may change or may not. But that's something that now I think will have a big impact around the world in terms of creating a common understanding for what qualifies as energy transition, what qualifies as having impacts not just on climate, by the way, biodiversity and other ESG issues. So I would say, while there's quite a lot going on in ESG in the US and other parts of the world, on the regulatory front, the EU is driving a lot of action.
I would just say, if I could add on to that, which is a really great summary briefly, I'd go so far to say that the EU is significantly ahead of the US. And for companies like GE that may be headquartered in the US, we have to pay even closer attention to the EU to ensure compliance, to ensure that we're keeping up with those trends and developments, and we're prepared. The pace and the scope of those issues, their system is different. They move, I think, more consistently ahead, and they've just been doing this a bit longer. The US is catching up, I think, very quickly, but we look, I think, more to the EU, and we have to think like an EU company on these issues and less like a US company to make sure that we're keeping pace with what's happening there.
Okay. Great. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left here. And I know a bunch of you are itching to catch Mike Gerard's climate update at 5 o'clock. So we'll try to get you out of here on time. But maybe we can just, see if the panelists have any closing thoughts. I mean, what's most, given our conversation today, what's most pressing on your mind, about ESG as we proceed through this year? Steve, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think what's most pressing is we've seen a confluence of crises, from COVID to climate to war to inflation, and that it's important that in these times we don't say, oh, well, we should remove gas tax or things like that. We need to double down. I mean, as big as the problems are, the one thing we've learned is if we don't address them up front, it'll just get worse. And the second big thing for all of these challenges, particularly for climate, is that we have to understand, I think we all do, and Roger kind of alluded to it earlier, is that while it affects all society, it will affect people who are disadvantaged and Black and brown communities much harder. And we have a responsibility. The financial institutions spent a lot of time perpetuating this through redlining and other things, and we collectively have to be very proactive to ensure that there is a just and inclusive future going forward. Thank you again to you and the colleagues.
I'd just say briefly, focusing on the year, complementing what's been said, I think I would sum the year up as action. That we've seen a strong foundation the last few years to create commitments, to set up platforms and networks. But this is a year, I think, where action, not to imply there hasn't been action. Lots of people have been doing lots of action, including GE. But I think there's more accountability for action at this point, and seeing the commitments being implemented and investments in those directions, actions in those directions. So it's kind of a good place to be. I think we've kind of set the stage in a lot of ways, and now we get to implement it, we get to operationalize it, and that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, it's almost, the challenges remain kind of daunting and a little bit intimidating, but it gives me a lot of hope to see, this group and kind of the rest of society finally converging around these issues. So maybe we can tackle them and make the world a little bit better for the next generation. Well, I think that rounds it out for our panel today. I'll flip it back over to Madison, perhaps, to close us out.
This is Chandler here. Madison had to step off for a second, but just want to say thank you all so much. Really appreciate your many contributions to today's program, and so appreciate everyone for asking really thought-provoking questions. Hope you continue to watch this space in the years ahead, and thank you all so much for your time.